was washed up, plain and simple. My marriage was a disaster zone, and I was one wrong move away from getting canned at the plant. I was drowning my sorrows in booze, drinking until I blacked out, only to wake up gasping for air under the weight of fresh regrets. I was hanging on by a thread, a frayed one at that. One bleak November morning, that thread snapped. I'd passed out cold on the sofa at home after cracking open a cold one on Friday evening the minute I clocked out of work. I remembered the first bar I stumbled into and how damn good that first drink tasted. It was a shot of rye, straight up, and it ignited a bonfire in my gut. I felt like $1,000,000, so I flagged the bartender down for another. After that, the lights went out until my eyelids peeled open, and pain sucker punched me in the face. I groaned, a sound like a dying animal. Hangovers are a harsh reminder that getting plastered is a fool's errand, but I had never been much of a student when it came to learning from my mistakes. At that precise moment, I was all in on admitting I had screwed the pooch. I would have sold my soul not to feel like that again. I would have sworn off the sauce, started choking down healthy food, maybe even dragged my sorry ass to a gym. Maybe that was the fork in the road where my life could have taken a turn for the better. But as I lay there, reeling from the throbbing in my head that had spread like wildfire to my insides, I realized someone was looming over me. I strained to focus, and the blurry shapes slowly coalesced into the love of my life, Mary Lynn. She had never been a homecoming queen, but she had stolen my breath the first time I laid eyes on her. She'd been kicking the tire of her beat-up car because it was flat, and once I'd managed to get my lungs working again, I sauntered over and, like some kind of knight in shining armor, fixed it for her. We were hitched 12 months later. She was 19, I was 20, which was way too damn young. I was 29, going on 60, that morning as I squinted up at her through the haze. I braced myself for her to start ripping into me, which was pretty much the only way we had been communicating for a while. Then I saw the tears cutting streaks through her makeup. "What is it?" I managed to croak out, trying to sit up. The pain shifted its focus to a point right behind my eyeballs. I squeezed out a tear myself and blinked. "Look here," she said, her voice trembling, and pointed at the TV. The screen showed the inside of a store. It had been completely trashed, ripped to shreds. The contents of its shelves were scattered all over the floor. Broken glass shimmered in pools of some kind of murky liquid. A strip light dangled precariously, barely attached to the ceiling by a stray wire, and the front window was shattered, a jagged hole gaping in the middle. Then a newsreader's emotionless voice informed the viewers that the shocked owner was greeted by this horrifying scene when he went to open up his family business at 5 a.m. this morning. Police would like to speak to this man who was captured on the shop's CCTV. A grainy image flickered onto the screen. A man, unshaven and with wild eyes, standing amid the chaos and destruction. It was me. I looked at Mary Lynn, my heart sinking into my stomach. "I don't remember," I stammered, beginning to panic. She turned away, her face etched with disgust. "Get out," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "And don't come back." If I had been stronger, had an ounce of decency in me, I would have marched down to the police station and turned myself in. I would have accepted whatever consequences were coming my way for my inexcusable drunken behavior. But all I could muster inside me as I stumbled out into the street was a spiraling vortex of self-loathing and gut-wrenching fear. I'd lost my wife, I was about to lose my job, and the thought of prison paralyzed me with terror. I needed to disappear, to vanish into thin air, before someone recognized me on the damn TV news and gave the cops my name. That was the only thing rattling around in my brain. I went straight to the coach station and bought a one-way ticket that would take me as far away as possible from everything I had ever known. It took 5 days to reach the end of the line, and then I started hitchhiking, sticking out my thumb and hoping for the best. The drivers, for the most part, liked to talk, to bend my ear. One guy, who smelled even worse than I did after a week in the same damn clothes, told me he knew a place that was hiring if I was looking for work. "It's a no-questions-asked type of place," he told me with a knowing look in his eye. He chain-smoked as he drove, constantly flicking the ash out the window. I was shivering with cold, and my teeth were chattering so hard I could barely speak when I replied, "Sounds like my kind of place." "How much further is it?" "Well," he answered, pausing to light up yet another cigarette. "You need to keep heading north until you hit the Arctic Circle, and then keep going beyond a town that old-timers like me still call Barrow. There ain't no signposts for the place I'm talking about, but it's as good a hiding place as any for a man who's running away." Saying this, he turned and gave me a wink that sent a shiver down my spine, and this time it wasn't just because of the cold. I hadn't told this man anything about what had happened, hadn't breathed a word of it to anybody. I guess it must have just been written all over my face. He dropped me off at a lonely intersection. A gas station, a greasy spoon diner, and a rundown motel huddled together around the road, as if they were trying to keep warm in the frigid air. By now, the bitter temperature felt like it had seeped deep into my bones, and I wasn't sure I would ever feel warm again. I checked into the motel, using a phony name and paying with almost the last of my cash. It was only early afternoon, but the sunlight was already fading fast. The further north I had traveled, the shorter the days had become. That day had been fleeting, and darkness obscured the distance as I stood looking out of the motel room window. When I had registered using a false name and paying with almost the last of my cash, I had told the motel clerk I was hoping to head to the place north of Barrow that was taking on workers. He'd looked at me with a mix of disgust and sorrow but said nothing. The next morning, I was about to head out to the diner for what could be my last meal for a while, due to my financial plight, when the clerk said, "There's a big fellow at the diner, tucking into a mountain of grits, who works at the place you're looking for, if that's really the path you want to travel." A man with his feet on the ground would have heard alarm bells at that moment. I merely thanked him and strolled across to the diner. The light and the warmth I felt inside were welcome, and the smell of coffee was a lifeline. Most of the tables were empty, but I wandered over to one that was already occupied. Describing someone as a big fellow up here was a bit like describing a biker as that fellow in a leather jacket, but I was confident I had found my man. He must have been close to 7 feet tall. His face showed years of hard living, his head was shaved, and he had a single crimson tear tattooed beneath his left eye. I asked him, "Do you mind if I join you?" He nodded and continued to shovel his breakfast into his mouth. I put it to him directly what I wanted, and after he had finished eating, he said, "You got that look about you of a man who wants a place to hide out while trouble makes its way by." This made me vow not to play poker with anyone for a long while. A few minutes in my company was clearly all it took to read me. "So I'll not try and dissuade you," the big fellow went on. "I'm foreman at the warehouse. If you want a job, I'm willing to give you a chance." "Mighty grateful," I said and followed him out to his truck. He moved with an easy grace that belied his size and didn't seem to notice the cold. A few minutes in the wind, which had picked up while we were in the diner, was enough to make me feel physically sick. My hands shook so badly as I tried to do up my seatbelt that I gave up. Observing this, the big fellow grinned. "There's an old fur-lined coat in the office at the warehouse. If it's not got up and walked out due to all the fleas living in it, you can borrow it." I smiled. I was so cold my face muscles were locking up, so it probably looked like a grimace. The big fellow kept grinning and started the engine. We drove through the darkness. There was a brief interlude of daylight, and the landscape it revealed was bleached of features. This was a barren, snow-covered land. Darkness soon returned, and the big fellow turned the headlights onto full beam. After long hours, lights came into view in the distance. As we came closer, I saw they were coming from a building. It was vast. The lights were fixed into the ground and ran the length of the building as far as I could see. There was nothing comfortable or welcoming about this display. We rattled to a stop in front of the building, and the big fellow turned to me. "Follow me," he said. Reluctantly, I left the shelter of the truck. The wind of earlier had dropped, and there was a captivating stillness. The air was freezing. I could feel it biting into my skin. This was no time to be hanging around. I hurried after the big fellow as fast as I could. He was punching a combination into a keypad by a door, and I did not want to be left outside. The door opened, and he let me pass, then pulled the door locked behind us. We entered an open, well-lit space that ran around 3/4 of the length of the building, I estimated. Stacks of containers stood here and there. There were no other people around, and as I kept pace with the big fellow, our footsteps were the only sound. At the end of the open space, we reached a partition wall. He punched in another code by another door and stepped through. A series of small rooms lay on either side of a narrow corridor. "That's my office," the big fellow said, pointing at one of the doors. A window opened out onto the corridor, and I could see a desk and chair, folders, books, and drawers. No sign of a laptop or other electronic devices. A whiteboard was covered in writing, divided into columns by hand-drawn lines. I was about to ask what exactly it was they did at the warehouse, then remembered what the man who had first told me about this place had said. It's a no-questions-asked type of place. The big fellow had not asked my name, had not asked for a social security number. Anything. I figured I needed to return the favor if I wanted to work there. That didn't stop me wondering, of course, and I almost immediately thought there must be something illegal happening. We had reached a small room with a fold-up bed and a couple of bare shelves. "You'll be sleeping here," the big fellow said. "Try and get some rest. You'll be pulling 12-hour shifts, and the first one starts in under 6. I'll leave that coat just outside." With that, he headed off. I lay on the bed and didn't think I would get a moment's sleep. My mind was racing about exactly what shady things were taking place. Was I at a distribution hub for hard drugs? Or maybe their stock in trade was illegal weapons or chemicals, sold in bulk and in no way approved by the FDA. Whatever was going on, the location meant there would be no prying eyes. It felt to me like the warehouse had been sealed off for the winter. I figured come spring, the network would crank back to life. But for now, the building remained still, lost in a wilderness that bordered a different world. A world of bustling cities, the internet's hum, Friday night lights, crowded shopping malls, a world which now felt like a distant memory. "Rise and shine, boy," a voice barked, and I snapped my eyes open. Guess I must have drifted off after all. The man looming over me looked to be in his 40s. He wore a long coat that brushed his calves. His hair was a solid gray, and a nasty, thick scar bisected one of his cheeks. Like with the big fellow's teardrop tattoo, no questions meant the story behind that scar was to remain untold. Probably for the best, I decided. Now that I'd had some time to stew, I was starting to realize what a bonehead I'd been, running all the way out to this godforsaken place because I'd panicked and freaked. Before, I was maybe looking at charges for criminal damage, something along those lines. I wasn't a lawyer, but now I had a sinking feeling I was a bit player in some serious operation. First chance I got, I was getting out of there, heading home, and facing the music. Scar Cheek, as I'd mentally tagged him, clearly didn't share the big fellow's easygoing smile. "You gonna get your butt in gear, boy?" he said with a sneer. "Gotta show you the ropes before I catch some Z's. Come on." He jerked a thumb toward the door. I went with the flow. He led me outside, starting by showing me the generator, tucked away around the back of the building. "This beast is more important than your mama," he told me gruffly. "It's wired to a control panel inside where we set the levels for the outside and inside lights, and without it, we got no light except during daylight hours." I chimed in. He gave me a look like I was a complete moron. "Boy," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "We are in the polar night now. The sun has set for the last time for 2 months, and it will be dark 24 hours a day for the next 67 days. I wrapped my arms around myself, suddenly chilled to the bone. I was mighty thankful for the coat the big fellow had left me. It was worn and filthy, but it was fur-lined and had taken the edge off the cold the moment I stepped outside. As the full weight of what Scar Cheek had said sunk in, the small comfort the coat offered seemed to evaporate. There was no way I could handle 2 months of darkness. Apparently oblivious to my growing misery, but more likely just not giving a damn, Scar Cheek launched into a daily routine of maintenance checks I would have to do. Then he said, "And when the road can be used again, we—" "What?" I spluttered, interrupting him. Again, he shot me that "what kind of fool are you look" and said, "We're going nowhere until the sun rises again in January." He went on rattling off my instructions, but I wasn't listening anymore. By the time he left me to start my shift, my mood was as bleak as my surroundings, and I went through my checklist barely paying attention to what I was doing. One of my tasks was to do a manual check of all the exterior lights. I stepped outside and was immediately met by the harsh glare of the lights. They illuminated the grim facade of the building in all its ugliness and reached out for dozens of feet across the empty, snow-covered ground, lighting up absolutely nothing. I began to trudge around the building. I started off trying to walk with the wind at my back, but quickly gave up on that. The way the wind swirled meant my face kept getting blasted no matter which way I turned. It was brutal. After what felt like an eternity of this punishment, I had almost completed my circuit of the building and was steeling myself to take a hand out of my coat pocket to punch in the door security code when I thought I saw a movement in the distance. Was there something out there, skirting the edges of the lights? Yes, I caught a glimpse of a silhouette, a shape moving fast on all fours. It must have been a wolf, I guessed, or maybe a bear. I had no idea what kind of creatures lived in this bleak and freezing wilderness. Ones, I decided, and definitely not ones I wanted to get up close and personal with. I spun around to the keypad and hurriedly punched in the code. Back inside, I was working my way through the rest of the list when the big fellow walked up. I noticed he had a holster on his belt and wondered why anyone would be carrying out here. But once again, no questions won the day. He smiled at me and said, "Glad to see you doing such a great job." "Sure," I said morosely. "Though I wish you'd told me I'd be stuck here for months." He kept smiling. "You'll make a good wage while you're here," he said. "And with no channels to communicate with the outside world, there'll be no one hassling us. I would have thought that suited you just fine." "Yeah," I replied. "We're living the dream. The three of us and whatever it was I saw outside." The smile remained plastered on his face, but there was a harder edge to his expression when he said, "There's a creature that's particular to these parts. I've only ever seen them from a distance, but even so, I'd say they're ugly. They hide from the light and embrace the darkness. Now there's no natural light because of the polar night. They roam freely through the wilderness." I was really not. I was liking the sound of this so much so that I ditched the no questions approach. "Are they dangerous?" I asked. "Not as dangerous as one of these," the big fellow said, patting his holster. "And now that the polar night is setting in, you should be properly equipped. Come with me, and I'll get you kitted out." "Thank you," I said quietly, a little uncertain. Sometime later, my shift finally over, I trudged back to my sleeping quarters, bone-tired. I passed Scarcheek, who was just starting his shift. "You should have warned me about the creatures," I muttered, more to myself than him. A sneer crept onto his face before he retorted, "They won't come near you while the lights are on. And if there's a problem, well, you can just draw and aim. They're critters and we're men. We're the alphas, you got that, boy?" I glared at him but didn't bother to reply. He chuckled to himself and added, "Now me and my best friends are going to check on the generator." Like a desperado straight out of an old cowboy movie, he swept back the sides of his long coat, revealing the pair of holsters attached to his belt. Then he swaggered on his way. I was frustrated with the big fellow, and I was really starting to loathe Scarcheek, and I was only one day into the polar night. I managed a measly hour of sleep in total and felt like a total wreck as I started my second shift. I began by checking the exterior lights. Each one glowed reassuringly as I walked past it, until I reached the last one, which was flickering erratically. I tried to recall what Scarcheek had told me I should do if this happened, but my mind drew a blank. He must have run over it while I was feeling sorry for myself and not paying attention. I tapped the perspex casing of the light with my knuckle and told it not to disrespect me. "I'm the alpha boy," I muttered. Somehow my tapping had done the trick, and the light resumed emitting a steady beam. Laughing at how low I had sunk, I decided to go find the big fellow and tell him what had happened. Maybe there was a problem that needed a proper fix. I made my way to the door and was just about to enter the security code to open it when the faulty light flickered once again, then went out completely. Then the one next to it did the same. "Damn," I said, then stood and watched, open-mouthed, as one by one, all the lights I could see died, plunging me into darkness. And I wasn't alone. There was something moving out there, one of the creatures, I was sure of it, unless it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. I told myself to focus, All I needed to do was enter the security code. Then I could head inside, find the big fellow and Scar Cheek, and one of them would know what to do. Only, I couldn't see past the tip of my nose. I would need to do this by touch. Not a problem, I assured myself, and pressed what I thought were the right keys. Nothing happened. I swore under my breath, turned around slowly. I'd heard a new sound. Snow crunching underfoot. Under paw, I corrected myself grimly, which really didn't help my state of mind. I returned my attention to the keypad. I was shivering badly now, as well as operating blind. I pressed again, my fingers clumsy with cold and fear. There were 5 numbers and then the hash key. Wrong again. I cursed, hellfire, and tried to enter the code a 3rd time, my heart hammering against my ribs. The sounds behind me were getting louder, closer. There was no denying it, no blaming it on the wind or my imagination. There was something moving in the darkness, and it was heading my way, relentlessly. I placed my fingertips on the keys. They were cold metal, so cold it felt like they were burning my skin. I ran my finger along the keys, ignoring the pain, and, counting out where I was, pressed the numbers one by one, ending with the hash key. There was a click. I turned the handle and the door swung open. I exhaled in relief, stepped inside, and managed a weak smile. The lights were still on in here, a beacon of hope. I began to run, began to shout, "The lights have gone off outside!" The big fellow was the first to appear, looking concerned. "Slow down," he said. "What are you saying about the lights?" "Flickered," I gasped, trying to catch my breath. "Went out, then back on, then nothing. All dark." I hadn't seen Scar Cheek emerge from his sleeping quarters, but there he was, his face like thunder. "What have you done, boy, you idiot?" he snapped, his voice dripping with contempt. "Nothing," I protested, my voice trembling. "They just went off, one by one." The big fellow held up his hands, trying to defuse the situation. "Easy there," he said calmly. "It'll just be a glitch, some problem in the system, which can be easily fixed." I nodded, feeling a glimmer of hope. That sounded good to me. Problems sorted. Then I remembered the other, more pressing problem. "There was something out there," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "It was coming towards me." "Ah, yes, the creatures," the big fellow said, his tone dismissive. "Let's not worry about them. They'll keep to the darkness outside and won't try to come in here while the inside lights are on." He flashed his by now familiar reassuring smile, and I started to feel a little better, a little calmer. Then he added, "And of course, because the doors are closed, they can't get in anyway." I stopped feeling relieved, and panic surged through me again as I tried to remember. Had I closed the door behind me? I swore inwardly. "What is it, boy?" Scar Cheek asked, his eyes narrowed, suspicion etched on his face. I think I left the door open," I replied, my voice filled with dread. "You heap of worthless junk." Scar Cheek spat these words out like venom, then flicked back his coat with a flourish and, with a lightning-quick movement, drew his weapon. "I got this," he said, his eyes glinting with a dangerous light, and began to walk purposefully in the direction of the door I'd left open. "You go with him," the big fellow said, his voice firm. "Give him backup. I'll be along in a minute." Then he turned on his heel and ran toward his office, presumably to check the system or grab another weapon. I did the last thing I wanted to do. I headed back toward the open door and the things waiting in the darkness. I got there to find Scar Cheek standing in front of the open door, both of his sidearms blazing. He was firing out into the darkness, clearly loving every second of it. "Yeehaw!" he cried when he ran out of ammo, then reloaded with a manic grin and let rip again. I wanted to cover my eyes. I desperately wanted him to stop, but he wouldn't have listened to me even if I'd found the words. Thankfully, the big fellow caught up to us, his heavy footsteps crunching on the snow. "That's enough!" he yelled when Scar Cheek had once again emptied his chambers. Scar Cheek scowled, his face a mask of annoyance, but didn't argue. The big fellow had brought a torch with him, and he moved toward the open door and flicked it on. A powerful beam sliced through the inky blackness outside, revealing a hideous, blood-soaked scene. Bodies lay strewn across the ground, their blood staining the pristine snow crimson. I realized for the first time that the creatures were not wolves or bears or any animal I had known existed. Their corpses were around 6 feet long, and they were completely hairless. Their skin was unnaturally pale, almost translucent, but lined with darker veins that protruded like grotesque roadmaps. I could see the stark outline of their ribs, as well as the sharp, angular lines of their shoulder blades. They had paws but no visible ears or tails. From the unnatural way they had fallen after being cut down by Scar Cheek's relentless fire. I couldn't see their faces, and I wasn't sure I wanted to. And there were more of them out there, still very much alive. I could make out dark, restless shapes shifting just beyond the reach of the torch beam, their movements unsettlingly fluid. "You killed them?" I whispered, the horror choking my voice. "I sure did, boy," Scar Cheek replied, his voice brimming with pride. "That's what you get for loitering around these parts." Then he turned to the big fellow and said, "Isn't that right?" Instead of agreeing, the big fellow sighed, a sound heavy with resignation, and said, "You hothead, you've done shot up my truck as well. The engine's hold, and it'll take a heap of fixing." The big fellow sighed again, his shoulders slumping, and closed the door with a heavy thud. My own shoulders slumped in relief, and I managed a small, shaky smile. At least now the door was closed. There was no way for the creatures to get in, even if the inside lights failed completely. "Let's go see what the problem is," the big fellow said, his voice weary, and I was happy to follow him, grateful for the distraction. The control panel was on a wall at the far side of the main open space, just before the partitions began. Dozens of switches and dials were set into it, a confusing array of technology. The big fellow studied it, his brow furrowed in concentration, then frowned. "It's a connection issue," he said, his voice grim. "Most likely a cable has come loose." I jumped in with a question laced with hope, clinging to any possibility of a solution. "But we can fix it?" "We sure can," he answered, a flicker of reassurance in his eyes. "Once the connection is back, all you need to do to make the lights come back on is flip this switch here." He placed a calloused hand on a red lever in the center of the panel. "It's really simple." "Great," I said, my voice still trembling slightly. "So where's the loose cable?" "Outside," he replied, the single word sending a chill down my spine. My guts tightened into a knot of fear, and all of a sudden, my mouth was so dry I couldn't swallow. When I said, "What?" the word came out so quietly I doubt either of them heard. They were already busy anyway, focused on the task at hand. Scar Cheek was meticulously reloading his weapons, his movements practiced and efficient, and the big fellow was bringing out 2 more torches and holding them out, his expression grim. I wanted to protest, to say there's no way I'm going out there, but instead, I meekly took one of the torches from him, my hand shaking slightly. Once again, I must have been broadcasting my feelings, my fear palpable. The big fellow looked down at me, looked me directly in the eye, and said, "Has anyone ever told you you have a negative attitude?" Scar Cheek chuckled at this, the sound harsh and grating. I had no reply, no witty retort, and trailed after them as they headed back to the door that had been safely closed 15 minutes before, a lifetime ago. It opened silently, and holding their torches in front of them like shields, they stepped out into the darkness. I followed, my heart pounding in my chest. The first thing I did was almost fall over one of the corpses, my foot catching on its frozen limbs. I steadied myself, my breath catching in my throat. "Move in circles as you walk, pointing your torch forwards," the big fellow told me, his voice calm despite the situation. "That way, the creatures will keep their distance." "Uh-huh," I replied, my voice barely a whisper, and spun slowly round in a circle, the beam of my torch cutting through the darkness. The light picked out yet more of the creatures as they flinched and moved back, too quickly for me to see more than a pale limb or a glimpse of glistening skin. I kept circling and moved forward as I did so, the light a fragile barrier between me and the unknown horrors that lurked in the shadows. The mouth of one was momentarily illuminated for a second, and I glimpsed bared teeth, sharp and predatory. Then it slipped back into the cover of darkness. Our progress was slow, torturously so to me, each step an agonizing effort, but eventually, we reached the cluster of cables and equipment at the heart of which sat the generator, its silence ominous. "You two give me cover," the big fellow said, his voice firm and commanding, and his scar cheek and I created crisscrossing barriers of light. He got to work, his movements precise and efficient. After 10 minutes or so, he grunted, a sound of satisfaction. "I think that's fixed it," he said, his voice laced with relief. "Now let's get back inside, and fast." We retreated back toward the door, our torches cutting through the darkness. "Not far now," I said, my voice tight with anxiety, and then I stumbled, fell heavily. I landed with a sickening thud on the corpse I had tripped over, the cold seeping through my clothes. My torch hit the ground, the beam pointing impotently upwards, illuminating nothing of use. The beams of the other torches hit me in the eye, blinding me momentarily. They'd seen what had happened and both cursed me, their voices filled with frustration and fear. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice cracking with panic. "I'm sorry." The corpse was still warm, disturbingly so, its skin hard and slick where my hands touched it as I struggled to push myself upwards, until I felt something tug at my leg, a cold, insistent pull. Then a shot rang out, close and deafeningly loud, the sound echoing through the desolate landscape. I flinched violently but managed to grab hold of my torch and swing it wildly toward my leg, where I saw the body of a creature, its form twisted and grotesque. The top of its skull had been split open by the bullet, and it wore a mask of blood, its eyes wide and unseeing. It twitched spasmodically, its limbs flailing in a final, desperate attempt to cling to life. Then silence descended. I felt a tug at my collar, and I looked up. It was the big fellow hoisting me to my feet with a single hand. In his other hand, he gripped the weapon he'd used to dispatch the creature before it could bite me. Beside him, Scar Cheek was sweeping his torch in rapid circles, encompassing the three of us within its protective light. A solid wall of shadowy figures surrounded us, held back only by that flickering illumination. "I know what to do," the big fellow stated. "Back to back, we rotate together." I obeyed, and we resumed our agonizingly slow journey of a few feet toward the door and the sanctuary it promised. The big fellow punched in the code, and I saw the blessed light spill out as he opened the door. I followed him into the warehouse, eager for escape. Scar Cheek hesitated. The big fellow hissed at him. "What are you doing?" "One more for luck," Scar Cheek replied, drawing his weapon. I saw one of the dark shapes fall, collapsing into the darkness. Scar Cheek grinned, lowering his torch as he turned and stepped toward the door. Then his body abruptly tensed. His eyes rolled upwards and his knees gave way. He pitched forward, landing face first on the ground, and I saw the bloody gash that ran the length of his spine. I glimpsed extended claws, razor sharp and tipped with crimson. Then the creature scurried away from the light of my torch, disappearing into the shadows. "We have to help him," I yelled, lunging forward toward Scar Cheek. "Leave him, you fool," the big fellow roared. "He's dead. We need to get this door closed. We can't just leave him," I shouted back in disbelief. "No!" The big fellow screamed the word at me, and I retreated back through the open door just as the inside lights flickered ominously, then died completely. It was pitch black inside now as well. I cried out in despair. "You didn't fix it. You made it worse. Go to hell," the big fellow bellowed. I swung my torch toward him, saw him struggling to close the door, but unable to because the creatures were forcing their way in. I scrambled backward, the beam of my torch painting frantic patterns on the floor as it wavered in my trembling grasp. I swung it back upward to where the big fellow was battling. The creatures, leaping up at him, were easily reaching his throat, big as he was. Their claws slashed at him with vicious intent. Blood spurted out in sickening bursts. The light of my torch momentarily drove them back, and I hurried toward the big fellow, desperate to help. He was staggering, clutching his right hand to his wounds. Blood gushed through his fingers. With his other hand, he pointed his torchlight at the open door, desperately trying to keep more of the creatures from pouring in. I realized with sudden clarity, "The switch!" I exclaimed. "Will it still work?" He looked at me, trying to speak. Blood bubbled inside his mouth, then began to spill out in a crimson tide. His legs buckled beneath him and he collapsed. I stood there helplessly, staring down at his lifeless body. My hand was shaking so violently that the beam from my torch jerked about crazily. I forced myself to hold it steady and once more began to sweep it in a frantic circle. I saw teeth bared, claws raised, and the arched backs of the creatures as they closed in on me. I saw them in glimpses, in fleeting moments, as the beam of light passed over them. They were 10 feet away, then 8. I knew I could not keep them all at bay. In seconds, they would be upon me, and I would be dead, torn to shreds. I turned and ran, fear lending wings to my feet. The beam played across the floor as I raced toward the control panel, my only hope. Behind me, I could hear them running, relentlessly bearing down on me, but I dared not look back. I could not stop. My life depended on it. I ran, gasping for breath, my lungs burning. Sweat streamed from me and I ran. I ran for my very life. I threw myself at the control panel and, guided by the desperate beam of my torch, located the switch. If it worked, I had a chance, a sliver of hope. If it didn't, I was history, nothing more than a memory. These thoughts raced through my mind as I grasped the switch and yanked it down with all my strength. The lights flickered hesitantly, then burst into brilliant life, flooding the warehouse with blinding illumination. I turned to look back at the creatures. They were everywhere, hundreds of them, crouched on all fours throughout the vast warehouse. Their eyes, red and raw, were helplessly exposed to the glaring light, as they had no eyelids to shield them. Their snouts were long and as pale as the rest of their abhorrent bodies, and everywhere, their veins stood raised, pulsing grotesquely. In the ones nearest me, I swear I could see the blood surging within them. They bared their teeth, reared up in frustrated rage, but they were raging now at an enemy they could not overcome, the light. And they rushed from the warehouse in a frenzied stampede, scrambling over each other in their desperate attempt to escape. I waited until the last one had gone, then cautiously made my way back to the open door and stepped outside, into the relative safety of the night. I could see that the lights around the exterior of the building were working again, casting a comforting glow, and the creatures that had come so close to ending my life were almost out of sight, disappearing into the desolate landscape. That was 2 weeks ago, an eternity ago. It is December the 2nd, and I walk through the deserted warehouse, the unforgiving light illuminating my every step, and all I have left to do is think, to try to make sense of the horror I have witnessed. The polar night ends on January 23rd. The sun will rise again, bringing with it the promise of a new day. But there are still 51 long days to go until then, 51 days of darkness and dread. Outside, the darkness waits, patient and ever-present.